It's July in the garden, my friends, which means that it's time to enjoy your harvest, but it's also time to think about just what else you might be able to plant in the garden this season. There's still some things that you can get absolutely in the month of July. So Jacques, myself, and some familiar faces from around the epic gardening ecosystem are gonna share with you our top picks for July. My first pick is actually somewhere in this shot, and I think you're gonna be surprised because I mostly give you my edible suggestions, but this one is simply too good to be true, and that would be the wonderful Salvia. One of the things I'm the most pleased about in my landscape here at the Epic Homestead is I've finally gotten into ornamental landscaping with things like this Salvia. Now, this variety I actually forgot the name of. I grabbed it at a nursery, it was on clearance, but two varieties that we have are Violet Queen and Blue Victory, but there's so many different varieties of Salvia. Many are native to your climate. So I would actually look up the native plants in your area, see if there's a Salvia that fits your specific climate, but otherwise experiment with ones that you think are fun and interesting. So what you see here is Salvia in the mid-season. For me, it's a perennial plant. In fact, from zones 8 upwards, it's perennial, meaning that it's a great plant to start right now to get some late summer, early fall blooms, and then a reset and establish as it goes into that spring growth. But if you are in a colder climate, it might be a touch too late, but you can still grow it now, bring it inside in a pot, and then put it back out in the spring. But the thing I wanna say is I've let this get a little bit neglected. You can see all these little flower spikes here. These are all spent. This is what it would normally look like, and it's actually quite beautiful. It brings so many different pollinators. I've seen hummingbirds, I've seen monarchs, I've seen swallowtails, I've seen all sorts of different things just from these 3 salvia bushes right here. So the one thing I'll give you as far as a maintenance tip is to track these stems all the way down to where they start to branch off. This can go the second this is spent because I'm not gonna get any more production off of this. So throw on your favorite podcast, maybe the Beat podcast by Epic Gardening, and come through and just prune this down in the off season, and you'll get way more blooms. If you are a gardener who is growing corn, you've almost certainly heard the expression knee-high by 4th of July. And that is something that people have used to judge whether their corn crop would be successful or not, because if it's too short, you're probably not going to get a good harvest by the time summer is over. But I am here to tell you that that is false. Nobody uses that metric. In fact, it's a little bit outdated because most corn farmers nowadays are growing hybrid varieties that are definitely chest or head high by this time of year. But there is something that does matter, and that is whether you have 2 different types of corn growing at the same time, because if they cross-pollinate, you might end up with some mutant funky corn. I'm going to use my tomato plant here to explain to you why this matters. If a tomato plant gets pollinated by a different tomato plant, say even a cherry tomato back there pollinates my beefsteak, this is still going to look exactly like this fruit. This fruit is dictated by the plant itself, and we are enjoying that entire fruit, the flavor of it. It's not going to change in the same life cycle of this plant. But what might happen is that the seed that I collect from that fruit, plant and grow next year, will produce a different fruit that isn't the exact same as the one that it came from because it was cross-pollinated. Now take that example but put it to corn. What we're eating on the corn plant is actually the seed. So if that gets cross-pollinated by a different variety, that seed's going to change and then the flavor will thus change. How do we avoid this cross-pollination? Well, there's actually 2 different things you could do. The first one is timing. You want to look at the days of maturity for your variety. This one says 70 to 80 days. Let's just say 80 days to make it clean. You want to have a variety that's at least 2 weeks apart from this one. So this is 80 days. The second variety has to be at least 94, maybe even 100 days to maturity in order for those 2 plants to not create pollen at the same time and cross-pollinate. But that is still a little bit risky because those things can change. These numbers aren't actually very exact. There's actually a 10-day range on there. So the other thing you could do is have physical distance or barriers. Right here, where I'm about to start this new corn patch, is 100 feet away from the first patch I showed you in my front yard. There's also a fence, a bunch of trees. So the pollen from that corn patch is very, very unlikely to come over into this patch and ruin my second planting of corn. Of course, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is that I am now planting this corn. So this is well and away 14 days apart from that variety, and there shouldn't really be any problem with cross-pollination. But corn is something that you can get away with planting in July, and it should do just fine as long as you have another solid 3 months of growing season.
My absolute favorite salad green is arugula, and I like to be able to grow it all season long. The only problem is that it is a cool season crop, so it actually prefers temperatures somewhere between 55 to 65 degrees. Now, it can tolerate light frosts, but it will bolt in the heat. And right now we are in the middle of a heat wave in Chicago, which is why I am hiding in the only shady spot out on my deck garden. So if you want to grow arugula in the middle of the summer, you do have a few different options. You can choose to put it in a shady spot when temperatures are above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use shade cloths, or you can do what I'm going to do and grow it indoors. I have so many grow lights that I use to start my seedlings, but why not continue to use them throughout the rest of the season by growing some of my favorite plants inside? Now, you are going to need a container to grow your arugula indoors. So you want to look for something that, one, definitely has a drainage hole, and two, is about 4 to 6 inches deep at least, just to accommodate for the roots on the plant. Then when you are filling it with potting soil, make sure to leave a little bit of space at the top for watering. You want to keep the soil consistently moist, especially while you wait for the seeds to germinate, but make sure that you aren't overwatering. Typically, I find that my plants indoors don't need to be watered as much as the ones in my garden, just because it's simply not as hot as it is outside right now.
Woo! It is hot and humid this July in Florida, but I don't care because it's time to plant my fall crops. When you're planting your fall garden in Florida, it starts as early as July. This could be a really fantastic turning point for us gardeners because we get super excited about that cooler season that's come along. Naturally, to get in the fall spirit, I'm planning ahead for spooky season, and I've got my jack-o'-lantern pumpkins to plant. Planting pumpkins for a fall harvest in the Southeast is not the easiest task. We really have to nail that planting window just right. I'm going to sow my seeds about 2 times as deep as they are big, usually about 1 inch deep in the mound. The rule of thumb in my region of Central Florida is early July for our planting. The reason is because pumpkins have a long days to maturity, 110 days for some of those bigger pumpkins. So we make sure that we want to be harvesting before any frost threat comes by. But we also want our flowers to be blooming after the very peak of summer when it's so hot that it might kill off the flowers. Pumpkins like well-drained soil, but they also like it to be fairly rich. I'm going to provide my plants full sun, and when I water these plants, I'm going to make sure that I use drip irrigation so that the water is concentrated right at the base of the plant and the roots. Getting the foliage wet is going to be another recipe for disaster when it comes to fungal problems. Another tip for success with pumpkins is variety selection. I have to grow some of these jack-o'-lantern pumpkins for carving. They're just too fun. But I'm gonna have a diversity of varieties. I don't wanna put all my eggs in one basket. So I'm also gonna be growing a variety called Bulldog pumpkin, which was bred by the University of Georgia, and it's very disease resistant, as well as some Seminole pumpkins, which is the native pumpkin to this area and grows very reliably in our heat. Another excellent choice would be the Jack B. Little pumpkin, those small ones. Excellent decorative pumpkin with fewer disease issues. Don't wait until late July to plant your pumpkins. It needs to be planted earlier in the month.
It's finally July, and here in North Carolina, the garden is flourishing. We're still planting some summer crops. Some of us are even getting in second rounds of summer crops. So fall crops are just like not even on our brain right now. We're not even thinking about fall crops, but we should start. Our brassicas are gonna be things like cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and these things kind of grow like our tomatoes, eggplant, and peppers, and that they really kind of take a little bit longer to get going. They really like to be well and established before transplanting out into the garden. So starting these seeds in late July, or maybe even earlier if you live in a colder climate, that's just gonna give us a head start. That way we have plenty of time to grow out some strong and healthy seedlings that'll be ready to transplant out in September when we need to get them in the ground. Or again, maybe earlier or later, just depending on where you live. You might be thinking that starting fall seeds in late July is just way too early, but in my experience here in North Carolina, Zone 8A, it's the perfect time. This gives you 4 to 6 weeks to grow out some really healthy, strong transplants. We'll transplant them out in September, and then that gives you plenty of time to get a really great fall harvest right before the frost. Now, if you're wanting to overwinter some brassicas like we are fortunately able to do here in Zone 8A, that's a totally different story, and you'll want to start those much later. But if you're wanting a harvest in the fall, now's the time to start. Some of the brassicas I'm really excited to grow this fall are the twister cauliflower. I grew this in the spring. It was great. It has these really fun, like twisty kind of leaves. Also excited about this burgundy broccoli. I grew this in the spring also, and the purple color of this broccoli is just so vibrant, so fun, and it puts out a lot of these tasty side shoots. And I like the side shoots better than the main head of broccoli, so I like that this variety does that. Also, this Napa cabbage cabbage. I love, love, love kimchi, so I always have to have Napa cabbage on rotation, and this variety is a slow bolt, which is really nice. Also, these Long Island improved Brussels sprouts. I have never really been successful at growing Brussels sprouts, so I'm gonna take some tips from Jacques, and hopefully this year will be my year.
As gardeners, we've all had a familiar story arc. Maybe you bought one tomato plant or a pepper plant, got hooked, and decided to turn your entire yard into a vegetable oasis. Then one day you realize, I don't actually have any flowers, and actually you realize that you did that on purpose because you didn't think they were worth it. Well, I'm here to tell you that flowers aren't just beautiful, they also attract pollinators, birds, all sorts of life to your garden. They really make it feel more textured and alive. Even from here, leading up to my really towering Beaujolais sweet peas, you could just see how much more vibrant and alive the garden looks when it has a little bit of color in it. Now it is July, it is getting hot, and a lot of things really don't like getting started now, but I chose 3 flowers that you should be able to start right now and still get blooms before the end of the season. Something I did by accident when I chose all 3 of these flowers was that they all shared the same seed starting method. So I'm going to show you how to do it in containers as transplants and also directly in ground if you want to just go directly in ground. Now the 3 flowers in question are Cosmos, Chocolate Flower, and Coreopsis. This one is the plain Coreopsis. The cool thing about all 3 of these plants is that they are drought and heat tolerant, so they can handle the more extreme parts of summer, where maybe some other flowers like nasturtiums, for example, have already mostly burnt up in my garden. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that these all will bloom profusely, and a lot of them are actually native. The chocolate and the Coreopsis are native to different parts of North America, and this, by the way, does actually smell like chocolate, which is why it's called the chocolate flower. So how do you start these seeds and why are they so special? Well, all 3 of these need light to germinate. So what that means is that when you start them, you can't bury them too deeply in the soil or else they simply will never grow. Once you have your seed in hand, simply take it and sprinkle it on top of your seed starting mix. I am saying seed starting mix here, but I have just sifted potting mix. You want something that is not very chunky because we're not burying these. So we want them to have really good contact with properly pre-moistened soil. So all of this is already wet, it's fine grained, and that'll help it out tremendously in terms of germination. Now, once you have your seeds in, take some fingers and just simply press the seed down into that soil surface. And if your soil is wet enough, it should be even juicy enough that a little bit of water comes up and actually hits that seed. So that is exactly what you want to do when you're starting them as transplants, making sure that they're on the surface so they get plenty of light, and making sure that you start with moist soil so that they will definitely be wet at the very beginning. Now, let me show you how to do this in ground. It is very similar, but there are some tricks that make it a little bit easier. I want to get these Cosmos growing next to my recently planted tomatoes here. So what I'm going to do first is take my hand and then simply scrape the surface of the soil. What that's going to do is move aside any of that chunky stuff that sort of builds up on your soil surface. Anything that's chunky is going to get in the way of surface sown seeds. It's just never a good idea to leave it, trust me on that one. Now, once you do that, next I take my fingers and I roughen up the soil a little bit. I want the soil to be nice and soft before I get that seed into it. And then the last thing we're going to do before putting the seed in is get this ground really nice and wet, just like we did for the seed starting trays. Now that the water has soaked into the earth, we could take our seed. In this case, Cosmos seed is actually quite large. And then what I'm going to do is sprinkle it over this pre-moistened area. This is technically optional to press it in if you don't want to get your hands dirty, but I guarantee you it'll give you much better success than if you were to just leave them on the surface. After you press the seed in, give it a quick pass of water just like that, and that's it. Do that every single day until the seeds come up. Especially now that it's the summertime, this will dry out very quickly, but one quick pass of water like that will help ensure that those seeds stay nice and moist, and hopefully you get some good germination.
July is the month where I will start a second round of my favorite crops, specifically the ones that are fast growers, so have a shorter days to maturity. In this case, I'm gonna start some more zucchini seeds. So I absolutely love zucchini, but I don't have enough room to grow multiples of the plants that I necessarily love, but that is where succession planting comes in handy. So once my first zucchini plant has matured and started to produce fruit, that's when I go ahead and start my second round of seeds. And I just pop them up in a nursery container, and inevitably, something dies in my garden throughout the season. So when I have space open up, that's when I will replant the seeds that I'm starting this month. The variety I'm growing is round zucchini, and this is a bush variety, so it is absolutely perfect for container or small space gardening. But more importantly, its days to maturity is 45. So our first frost date here in Chicago usually falls sometime between mid to end of October. We still have over 3 months of gardening season here, so I can easily get a second round of zucchini.
This may come as a surprise to a lot of gardeners, but one of the best times of year to grow your solanaceous crops in Florida is in the fall. So in the end of July, I make sure to get in my eggplant seeds. Eggplants are started specifically late July and early August in our area because we need to line up the time of flowering with cooler nighttime temperatures of fall. So when I'm starting seeds in a hot month like late July, I always create a protected area. It could be under shade cloth, it could be in one of the more partial shade areas of your garden. I start them in seedling trays, and I keep a close eye on my trays to not let them dry out. These are tiny seeds, so we're gonna make sure they're not going in too deep. Just about a 1/4 inch is the best depth for sowing an eggplant seed. We're gonna put them in a good quality seed starting mix, and we're going to make sure that the trays don't dry out. When it comes time to transplanting, usually by the time the plants are about 6 to 8 inches tall and have a well-developed root system, we're going to transplant them in the garden. We're going to make sure they get full sunlight, maybe at most partial shade, and we're going to space the plants 2.5 feet apart so that they're really getting good air circulation. It's better to space eggplants farther apart down here in the south with our high humidity, so I go 2.5 feet apart minimum, providing regular water concentrated at the base of the plant. And when it comes to transplant time, we are going to harden off our plants, bringing them into full sunlight so they get used to the elements, and then we're going to transplant them out. This particular variety, long purple, is going to be an excellent choice for our region.
July is the perfect time to get in some second rounds of your favorite summer veggies, especially your summer squash. And if you live anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States, odds are your first round of summer squash probably got taken out by the absolute bane of my existence, the squash vine borer. And if you've never heard of or seen the squash vine borer in your garden, I just want you to take a moment, just be thankful. Be thankful that you've never seen or heard of this pest, because it is one of the most awful garden pests ever, especially if you're a squash lover like myself. The squash vine borer is a moth with a bright orange thorax, so it's easily identifiable in the garden. And what it does is it lays its eggs on any of your cucurbits, so your squash, pumpkins, gourds. It's also been known to attack cucumbers as well. It'll lay its egg. Those eggs will hatch, the larva will bore into the stem of your squash, and it'll basically begin eating your squash from the inside out. The eggs are really hard to see, so it makes it hard to seek and destroy and remove those eggs. And usually your squash plants will not show signs of infestation until it is far too late and that plant is gone. It quite literally seems like it kills your squash plants overnight. Like, one day your squash plant is beautiful, healthy, thriving. Next day you wake up, it's dead. Some winter squash varieties are highly resistant to squash vine borer, and these are gonna be your Cucurbita machadas. So your butternut, Seminole pumpkin's another good one, tan cheese pumpkin, etc. If you live in an area with squash vine borer, I highly recommend planting Cucurbita machadas. But unfortunately, the summer squash varieties that we all know and love, like our Black Beauty zucchini and like our straight neck yellow squash, those are either gonna be Cucurbita maxima or Cucurbita petbo, and unfortunately those are not resistant to squash vine borer at all. So one way we can kind of get around and avoid the squash vine borer and get a harvest of summer squash is to plant them in late July. By the end of July, the squash vine borer will have slowed down their egg laying cycle, and they will have completely stopped by the middle of August. I'm going to be direct sowing some Black Beauty zucchini, some straight neck yellow squash, and a new variety that I'm really excited about. The seed packet is absolutely destroyed, but it is this type of patty pan squash called, I don't speak French, Jaune et Vert. That's my best shot, but it's really pretty. It's like white with these green stripes around it. So I'm really excited to see that one.
For me, July is about squeezing the most out of what's existing in the garden and growing, but also setting myself up for the rest of, at least in my climate, a pretty long season. So I've got something that I love, I can't get enough of, and that would be cucumbers. So this is my current cucumber A-frame. It's not even all the way up yet, and I'm already thinking about the next sowing. And I've got some pretty nice ones right here. Actually, this one's just about ready. Nice pickling cucumbers, because for me, I like eating them fresh in salads, but I really like to make my own pickles, and I do that over on the Epic Homesteading YouTube channel. But if you're going to get some cucumbers going and you want a second sowing of them, there's a few varieties I'd recommend. If you're in a container, Space Master 80. This is like the first cucumber I ever grew when I first started gardening, actually from botanical interests. But you want to look for lower days to maturity. So I've got 62 days on this guy, but then you've got Poinsett 76, that's 65 days. And then you've got something like Homemade Pickles, which is something I'm going to sow because I want a pickle, and that's 55 days. So if you're planting mid-season, you want that days to maturity number to be a bit lower, so you have a little bit of extra time to get that plant in the garden and growing before your particular season ends. So the way that I like to do it, now we've actually tested, should you direct sow, should you transplant cucumbers? You can do either. Our logic in the past is that if you direct sow and transplant, the direct sown cucumbers kind of catch up to the transplanted cucumbers, but we tested it this year and they actually don't. And so for me, because I don't really have space just yet in the garden, I'm not going to direct sow. I'm just gonna go into my Epic 4 cells with about 2 seeds per, and I'm going to wait until this plant starts to look a little bit dead, diseased, dying, or spent. Now, the beauty of having a second sowing is that you don't have to squeeze every little bit of yield out of this cucumber, because as it gets to maybe the back half of its life and it starts to look a little scraggly and you might get 1 or 2 more cucumbers, it's quicker and better to rip it out and replace it with these cucumbers that are going to rock it up much faster. So to me, overlapping that season with something you really love and you want to stretch out more, sometimes it's better to grow twice compared to once. But starting cucumbers is quite literally just the beginning of their journey. So if you want some tips on growing them in containers, check this video out right here. You can shop any of these varieties at botanicalinterest.com. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.